It was my mom calling again, but it's a call that no one wants to receive. 네가 앤디랑 얘기했어? 앤디가 괜찮아? 한번 전화해봐. Have you talked to Andy? Is Andy okay? Try and call him. It was 8:50 a.m. Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001. This was a day that changed my life forever. Andy and I had been friends since college, and we had dated for a few years, and we had actually just started to look at engagement rings. Andy worked in the World Trade Center. A few minutes after getting off the phone with my mom, my cell phone totally stopped working. And in a panic, I decided to go outside and try to use a payphone. It was actually the first day of my PhD internship in New York City. And when I went out onto the street, it was filled with people running to escape New York City. And I could hear snippets of what people were saying. The planes crashed. The towers are on fire. People are jumping from the building. Everyone was impacted by 9/11, and I wasn't much older than most of you in this room. I had actually attended my first Urbana with Andy the year before 9/11. Our lives are marked by moments. Moments that shape us. Take a moment right now and think about a moment that has shaped your life. Maybe it's the moment that you found out that you weren't going back to campus because of COVID. Or maybe it was the moment this week that you found out that your flight to Urbana was canceled and you need to scramble and find new travel arrangements. Or maybe it's a moment from your childhood. Moments shape us, and particularly, moments that wound us have a profound impact on us. And this makes me think about another woman. Let me tell you about her. This woman's life was marked by trauma. At a young age, she got married to an immigrant, but suddenly he died, leaving her a widow and childless. But what she decided to do was to remain with her mother-in-law. And so they returned back to her husband's home country. But it was there that she lived a really difficult life because she had to live as an immigrant in poverty. And daily, she depended on people for food. And it was degrading, and it was dangerous. She was a widow. She was a migrant worker. She was an immigrant. And her name is Ruth. And her story is told in the Bible. Because of the many wounding moments in Ruth's life, her life was changed forever. What life-changing moments have you experienced? What traumatic and wounding moments have shaped your identity? Trauma is anything that's distressing, and it actually affects how we cope and function. And it's subjective. So what's traumatic to one person may actually not be traumatic to another person. But why is that the case? Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm going to give you a 60-second PhD in mental health, 60 seconds, using Dr. Siegel's model of the brain. And guess what? No quizzes or tests. Okay, so what I'd love you to do is, can everyone hold up their hand like this? Imagine your hand is your brain, and your wrist is your brainstem. So the brainstem really controls all of your basic functioning, like breathing and sleeping and heart rate. And your thumb houses the amygdala. This is your feeling brain. So it's the center for your emotions and for your memory. Your fingers are your prefrontal cortex. This is your thinking brain. So it helps to process information and it regulates your emotions. Normally, your thinking brain is connected to your feeling brain. So you're able to be in control and use reason. But when you experience something that is traumatic or wounding, your thinking brain disconnects from your feeling brain. It's called flip your lid. So what happens when you flip your lid is you actually can't use logic anymore. You go into fight or flight mode and you start to panic. You feel out of control, you feel anxious, you feel stressed out, and your view of the world is changed. But most of all, your view of Jesus is altered. Who here has asked, Jesus, if you are really good, why would you allow that to happen in my life? Do you really love me? Are you really a good God? I know that I've asked those questions. And often what happens is our woundedness is at tension with our understanding of Jesus. But Jesus is the wounded healer. Like Ruth, Jesus was an outcast. Like Ruth, Jesus suffered and was wounded. And we know that because of the cross, we are not crushed by our woundedness. Our woundedness does not have to crush us. Let's go back to the story of Ruth. So how is it that Ruth was able to use her woundedness to be able to find hope and healing? Well, despite her suffering, Ruth chose to remain with her mother-in-law. In other words, Ruth chose to love. Even though Ruth wanted to be loved, Ruth chose to love. And despite having to glean from what she thought were random fields, Ruth happened upon the fields of Boaz, Naomi's relative, her kinsman redeemer. In other words, Ruth chose to trust that God had not forgotten her. She chose to hope that God loved her. And despite her circumstances, Ruth trusted that Boaz would provide for her and Naomi. In other words, Ruth chose to trust that woundedness was not the end of her story. It was not going to be what defined her. It was not going to crush her. She chose to love, hope, and trust. And this story of God shaping people through their woundedness is what I see at International Justice Mission every day. IJM is a global organization that protects people in poverty from violence. And over the past 10 years of working at IJM, I have witnessed thousands of survivors choose to use their woundedness and their voices to demand that people are protected and safe. They are the ones that are saying, we demand that people are protected. How is this possible? Well, let me tell you about a modern day Ruth. Her name is Ruby. Ruby knew that being born a girl in the Philippines in poverty meant that the odds were stacked heavily against her. Her parents were farmers, And they tried to work hard to provide for Ruby, and her 10 siblings. But when Ruby was 15 years old, her parents died. And it was in this moment of vulnerability that Ruby was trafficked and was a victim of sexual violence. Listen to her words. Never in my whole life had I anticipated to experience the horrors of trafficking, witnessing and doing things I could hardly imagine as a teenager. I blamed myself for being trapped in the dark world. But Ruby did not give up. She said she would scream when she heard police sirens outside, desperate that someone would hear her. And on one occasion, she was screaming in the bathroom and fell asleep on the cold bathroom tile, saying, "God, if you are real, you take me out of here." And God moved in an unmistakable way the very next day. Ruby awoke to the sounds of police and IJM coming to remove her from exploitation. Ruby was free physically, but you know what? Her journey of healing and restoration was just beginning. Listen to Ruby's words again. It took me years to recover from the traumatic experience. I was haunted by bad memories. But God never stopped sending people with the purest hearts to help me recover and gain healing. And today, that story of the wounded healer continues. Ruby is a college graduate. She is a mother, and she is an advocate who is choosing to use her woundedness and to raise her voice to demand that people who are vulnerable are protected. That is the story of the wounded healer in Ruby's life. But again, we ask ourselves, how? How did she do it? How was it possible? Well, Ruby chose to love and be loved. She says that God sent people with the purest hearts to surround her. She needed to accept love, and she needed to also give love. She needed that from her community. Ruby also says that she chose to hope. She hoped that God was a God of justice and that he could bring justice. So she chose to participate in the trial against her traffickers, which is a very, very difficult decision. And her traffickers are in jail for 15 years. And Ruby chose to trust. She trusted that God was not going to let this be the end of her story. Woundedness was not going to be the conclusion. God was going to heal her and use her woundedness to bring hope and healing. Right now, there are millions of people in poverty who are vulnerable to violence. There are 50 million people living in slavery. And 1 in 3 women and children experience sexual and physical violence. For some of you in this room, you know that very personally. And for all of us, that is a staggering number. So you may be sitting here wondering, what can I do? What can I do sitting here in the bleachers of Urbana? Well, we can choose to bring healing and hope into our circles of influence, into our small groups, into our communities, into our friendships. We can also choose to advocate and raise awareness and say, we want people to be protected. We want people to have access to healing and hope and restoration. And we can also, most importantly, pray. Pray for people like ourselves and like Ruby, who are choosing to love, hope, and trust in the wounded healer, Christ. A few days after 9/11, the Washington Post published an article about a simple and yet profound event. In the wreckage of the World Trade Center, in the hellish wasteland, in the rubble, workers found a 17-foot cross. The wasteland, the reality of the rubble around the cross remained the same. It was unimaginable. It was a wasteland of pain. It was devastating. And yet, somewhere buried inside was the cross. What is your rubble? What is your rubble? Are you finding yourself at your ground zero? There are moments that God is calling us into, moments that will shape us, moments that will define us. And these moments can either crush us, or in them, we can choose love, hope, and trust. And God calls out to us from those moments, and He invites us to make a choice. And if we're honest, we want those moments to be glorious. We want them to be amazing. We want them to be pain-free. But the reality is, Christ often uses our moments in the rubble, in the pain, to transform us. That is the mystery of the wounded healer. By His wounds, we are healed. And we can choose to love, hope, and trust in the wounded healer. In the way that I found Jesus in the rubble of 9/11, in the way that Ruth found hope in the rubble of being a widow, in the way that Ruby found healing in the rubble of being a survivor of trafficking. May we be open and sensitive to those moments and Christ's invitation to be changed in the rubble.